Welcome everyone to Growing Online Learning. This is presented by Illinois Community Colleges Online. The theme for this year's conference is Accessibility, the Road to Success. We hope the conference will provide strategies and practices for you to use to improve accessibility in online instruction. I'm Jeff Newell. I'm the Director of Illinois Community Colleges Online, or ILCCO, and we appreciate you being here today. And for those of you who will be reviewing the recording later, we appreciate you taking time to do that as well. ILCCO would like to thank College of DuPage for providing the web conferencing platform for use in this year's conference. College of DuPage is an ILCCO member. Please note that live captioning is available for the conference. You probably got a message to ask whether you wanted to use that or not at the beginning, but if you need assistance with that feature, please use the chat to ask and we'll see what we can do to provide assistance. And I want to thank Lara Tompkins from College of DuPage for doing live captioning for us for this session. Our schedule is on the screen. We have 6 sessions this conference, and we will address topics like using universal design for the development of effective, accessible learning environments, basic principles for creating accessible print and multimedia items, how institutions can approach improving accessibility, and how different LMSs address accessibility. Links and session information can be found at the conference website at ilcco.net under Resources and Events. If you have any questions on registration or accessing the sessions, you can contact me, Jeff Newell, at jeff.newell@illinois.gov. Archives of these presentations will be available at the conference website on ilcco.net following the conference. ILCCO is pleased to welcome Dr. Vance Martin. Dr. Martin is the Campus Accessibility Specialist for the Center for Online Learning, Research, and Service, or COLRS, at the University of Illinois Springfield. Vance has been working in accessibility since 2007. He teaches classes and workshops on accessibility. At UIS, he has worked with faculty and staff to help train them on accessibility laws and how to make materials accessible. He also leads a team of student workers who, since 2018, have made all the files for over 100 courses accessible. He has consulted with multiple higher education institutions in Illinois and works with Microsoft engineers to help make Office products more accessible. If you have questions during the presentation, you can put them in the chat room. There will be a couple of spots where Vance will pause to take questions. And also, as a reminder, please mute your lines if you're on the phone or using a headset and you have a microphone. Just mute that so we don't get any feedback or any crosstalk during the presentation. With that, I would like to welcome Vance. Thank you, Vance, for being here today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm going to put video on here for just 1 second so that you can all see me. And you can see that I have a lovely, colorful tie on and did dress up for this. But I'll save your bandwidth and turn the camera off for the rest of the presentation. But this gives you a little bit of a sense of who's talking to you. So I'd like to thank Jeff and the conference committee for asking me to give this talk. So I entitled it Accessibility is Civil Right. And I'll be using that term throughout the presentation, and I'll probably refer to capital CR civil rights versus lowercase cr civil rights, whereas at least in the United States, we often refer to capital CR civil rights as specifically focusing on African-American voting rights and equality within the US, whereas civil rights is much more open and includes LGBT and people with disabilities and Latinos and women and a much broader scope. So when I do use those terms, that's kind of how I'm talking about lowercase and uppercase civil rights. So this first section is going to focus a bit on background, and I promise that this is the furthest that I will go back is to ancient Sparta in about 500 BC. I was a historian for many years, and so I guess I just can't get away from this. But We're not actually sure that the Spartans did this. However, historians from about 2,300 years ago at least used to say that the Spartans would inspect babies at birth and deem them either fit or unfit, and those that were unfit were thrown off of a cliff to die, to create a better gene pool for the Spartan nation. And I would say that that idea has stuck with us, as we'll see as we go through this presentation. So that being said, with Sparta, we're now going to jump about 2,300 years forward in time. So when we think about disability, that there's several periods in it in recent history. So around 1800 in France, there was a boy who was found living out in the wilderness who was called Victor, or the wild boy of Aveyron, as can be seen here in this drawing by of a young boy who was found by Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard, who attempted to train or rehabilitate this boy to make it into everyday society. And I would characterize at least this rural agrarian point in history as a point in which we tried to accommodate and integrate people into society who had what we would today term learning, cognitive, or physical disabilities. It was a bit easier to do in that society, and as long as people were from that community, the community was willing to do so. If people were more affluent, it might have been more practical for them to, kind of in the Jane Eyre sense from the book, house the person in an upper room, and they didn't see much of society. But people could at least participate in certain activities in societies at that time. If people were not from a community, though, they would often be pushed around from town to town, usually leading to their demise. So within the United States, then, it's only a little over 200 years ago that we get this idea that we need to help those people who have one of the physical disabilities, either blindness or deafness. And so as you can see here, this drawing of a neoclassical mansion in a pastoral setting is a drawing of the Connecticut Asylum for the Education of the Deaf and Dumb Persons, created in 1817. So we start to get within different states a center where people with these specific disabilities can go to learn many of the basic things that we want people within our young nation to know. Basic, what we would normally term as reading and writing, which may have to be in a different form based on the form of disability. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to follow on two TVs, and so I hadn't clicked that. So here's that pastoral building. So shortly thereafter, we get the foundation of the Perkins Institute for the Blind in Boston, Massachusetts. This is an image of one of the initial buildings, a 5-story Beaux-Arts building, which was originally a hotel. And so Perkins is still around today and is a big leader in education and advocacy and creation of new technologies that help people who are blind or deafblind access modern life. Probably one of their most famous graduates is probably Helen Keller, who we'll speak about here in just a few moments. But again, so we go from Connecticut to Massachusetts, and shortly thereafter, you get the publication of Braille. And so you can see here in this image, it is a representation of the Braille alphabet, A through Z, along with numbers 1 through 0, which was first published in 1834. And so this was innovative as a method for people who were blind to be able to use raised pins in paper to figure out the letters and be able to thereby read. It was a very cost-prohibitive exercise to do because the publishing, you had to use thicker paper. The bindings would be bigger because of the way it was published. It couldn't be done on 2 pages. But this was, a way for those people who were blind to be able to understand anything anybody else could read. Today, we'll talk about just in a few minutes the way Braille has advanced a bit in our digital age. Today, you can also expect that about 37% of people who are blind can read Braille. That's mainly due to screen reading software, which we'll also talk about here in a few minutes. So at the height of the Civil War, we actually get the foundation of the National Deaf Mute College, which has changed its name to Gallaudet. You can see here a very early picture, about 1870, of the campus with only 4 buildings in Washington, D.C. So again, we're still thinking about how to educate people who have these disabilities and even avenues for higher education of people in American society. Along with that, we also start to begin to think about how do we train the actual teachers. So it's in 1884 in New York City at Columbia within their teachers college, with an image here of the exterior of their famous Gothic building, which houses the teachers college, that we see the first program within the United States that can train teachers who will then go to teach at institutes for the blind, typically in the various states throughout the United States. So typically every state has at least one school for the visually impaired, one school for the blind. I can say that I'm originally from Jacksonville, Illinois, and Jacksonville, Illinois is the home for the Illinois School for the Visually Impaired and the Illinois School for the Deaf. And as we'll discuss a little bit later, also used to be the Illinois State Mental Institution. But as we all know, agrarianism ends or begins to end around 1850, and industrialization takes its toll on many things within American society. So we have an image here from the 1850s, 1860s of a factory floor with a lot of women packed in a room with many machines. And so as we get more people moving to cities, as we get more people packed into factories whose jobs may be stationary and mundane, but require certain physical attributes or potentially require certain levels of being able to read at a basic level, that excludes a larger segment of society, people who may have been able to lift hay and lead horses and plow fields and things like that, who are unable to stand and do fine dexterous things and pick spindles and things like that off of looms or put them on there in order to make fabric. And so who is worthwhile in society begins to change because of some of these ideas. Similarly, our view on education changes drastically because of the Industrial Revolution. So in this image, it's from the mid to late 1800s. It's a classroom with a teacher drawn on a chalkboard with a lot of students apparently rapt, paying attention to the teacher. And I'm sure that most of us have seen this exact same image, or at least what occurs in this image, probably today. And it probably didn't look too much different as you may have walked past classrooms and seen an individual in front of a whiteboard. Perhaps they were at a computer with a projector projecting a PowerPoint, which kind of conveys the same idea. Maybe our students were less enwrapped in what was being covered because they might have had cell phones or something. But this is our model of education for the last 150 years. However, and I won't go too much into this here, as I have in other presentations, but there was no real research done in 1850 saying, hey, the best way to educate people is let's have one person in front of the class and 24 students in the class, and they'll just sit there and pay attention. There weren't those studies done. What was done was they applied the industrial model of how these factories were working, and they said, hey, this would be a very efficient method for training people. And so we had a lot of immigrants starting to flood the country. We needed to teach them basic English. We needed to also teach order, that we arrive at a school at a certain time. We do what the person in charge tells us. We leave at a certain time, so that this would help train people for that future work life on that factory floor. It also changed our view of somewhat of a meritocracy in how people make it in society, in that we go from, we have a child of X age attends Y class, and after a year of being in Y class, if they do well enough, they get to go to Z class, and then A class and B class and C class. And then those people that succeed potentially go to college and become the movers and shakers and cotton gin or cotton mill owners in our society. So this is a change that occurs in society, and it excludes a large group of people within the United States. So then the question becomes, what do we do with these people who are being excluded? And so, as you can see here in this image, it's a cover of a book from around 1900, Societal Control or Social Control of the Mentally Deficient. So our answer is, we're going to attempt to control the problem. So I would say that in this period, if we were to take much of the political discourse of our modern day, which surrounds immigrants, and replace that with people who have physical, cognitive, or learning disabilities, that the same ideas are attempted to be applied in the late 1800s and early 1900s within the United States, attempting to figure out, how do we control the problem of these unwanted people in society, these people who now no longer will fit in society, that we have no place for, and we don't want to continue within our society. And so the answer is, we're going to control them, or we're going to hide them. And so, as I said, Jacksonville is also famous, and every other state had one too, the Illinois State Mental Hospital. So it was a very large piece of land, a lot of buildings, so that you could put people into it, people who today we would typically put in the category of learning or cognitive disabilities, or at that point in time, women who had strange ideas about, what their place within society should be, or people who didn't quite feel in the right place in society. And so they would get housed in these large asylums and hidden away, so that we didn't have to see what the problem was. And so we have an image here, again from about 1900. So you can see in the image, it's a lot of older women, presumably with some sort of a mental issue, although we could certainly argue over whether that was a warranted issue at the time. But we're trying to hide our problems within society in this period. Or we could just get rid of the problem to begin with. And so eugenics, while we may often associate eugenics with the World War II German Nazi regime, was actually something that started in the United States. It started in 1907 in Indiana. And so between 1907 and the mid-1980s, there were 62,162 sterilizations of people with mental, physical, cognitive, or learning disabilities within the United States. As you can see in this image here, I highlighted in yellow, and I doubt anybody can see it. I can barely see it on my very large screen monitor here. But it's an image of Oliver Wendell Holmes. The quote says, "3 generations of imbeciles is enough," declared Associate Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes of the United States Supreme Court in a recent opinion, almost unanimous, upholding the Virginia Sterilization Law of 1924. So that was an 8-to-1 decision supporting that law. And so during this period in American society, which isn't really that far away, the 1980s, we made people unable to reproduce. And I would say that 39 states had these laws on the books. Some of these laws are still on state books. Most recently, California in 2014 used these exact same laws to sterilize female inmates. So the specter of these laws and the specter of our idea, which isn't really too far from the Spartan ideal, or at least what people attributed to the Spartan ideal, was to make sure that these problems don't continue to arise within society. And so we do have some individuals that become advocates and famous for their roles in supporting people and speaking out for people with disabilities. So Helen Keller was from Alabama. Here's an image of her with her nurse, Ann Sullivan. She lived from 1890 to 1968. So she died a few years before I was born. But she was born without any disabilities, and due to a childhood illness became deafblind. So she could not speak, or she could not hear, she could not see. And then over time learned how to use Braille and sign language and speak other languages. And as she learned more about the world, she began to see that there were a lot of injustices within the world. And so, yes, she did create the Helen Keller Foundation. She did work with the American Lighthouse for the Blind. She also campaigned for women's suffrage, for labor rights, for pacifism. She, along with Jane Addams, helped found the ACLU. And she was a socialist as well. So many times when we look at late 1800s, early 1900s advocates for these issues, they often get painted with a very broad swath, a red swath usually, saying that it was nice that they did what they did, but that because they looked out for all these other groups, that they may not have been as warranted. I think that Helen Keller certainly shows what is possible and what anybody can do, and she did a lot for people with disabilities and other minority groups, because this is a period in American history in which we begin to have people speak out. And it's probably rightly so. As we can see, this is about a 1950s image of an institution. So as you can see in this image, there's a bunch of crib-like beds, adult-sized, crammed into a room, and people with physical or learning or cognitive disabilities would often be housed in large rooms like this. I know growing up as a child, I had several friends whose parents were nurses and doctors in the state mental hospital. I visited once or twice. This from 1950 looks about the same as it did in about 1987. So this is how we're treating these people that we're hiding away and decreasing their abilities and to integrate into society. So this may seem like an odd image to incorporate into a discussion on accessibility, but this is really about civil rights. And so when we think about disability law within the United States, one of the key cases is that of Brown v. Board from 1954. And so we have an image here, Thurgood Marshall celebrating after the win of Brown v. Board, which overruled about a 60-year-old finding that separate cannot be equal. So in that finding, of course, it meant that you could not have a school for African Americans and a school for white people, and that they could be equal. By integrating them is how we get to equality. And so this is a key case, this finding of separate cannot be equal. And so while this case will lead to many protests in the American South, such as at the Pettus Bridge, and many documentations, so as we have the image of people protesting for equal rights on the Pettus Bridge, and many images on TV of people being hosed down and attacked by dogs. This movement will gain a lot of traction for African Americans, but it will also have a lot of impact on people of various other minority groups within the United States. Women, Latinos, LGBT a little bit later, and people with disabilities. So we have here an image of, if we look back, so it had only been 10 years, we have an image here of LBJ signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 with Martin Luther King behind him. So within a 10-year period, we go from integration of schools in America to federal support of voting rights and equality within the United States. One could argue that these rights have been guaranteed by the 13th through 15th Amendment, but this would allow greater federal enforcement to uphold those laws. And at this time in American history, there were voices within the decision making that said, should we include within this civil rights legislation also wording to protect people with disabilities? At the time, it didn't seem apparently politically expedient to do so. However, those voices only gained momentum within the next decade. And so it'll only be less than a decade later before we actually get to our first basically Civil Rights Act for people with disabilities. But in this period, we're going to begin having people protest for LGBT rights, as we can see from a LGBT protest. This would be after Stonewall. People protesting for the Equal Rights Amendment, which still has not passed, but this image would have been from the 1970s in a Reagan era California, right near the end of his governorship there. But also, for the protesters are often forgotten, those people with disabilities who protested to say, hey, we do need protection and civil rights in America to help us be on an equal footing and setting with everyone else within the United States. And so, as I said, within a decade, in 1973, so you can see from this picture of President Nixon signing the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. I'm going to, in a few slides, get a little bit more into detail, and I think that that'll be kind of in one more picture, actually, a place if people have questions, I can certainly answer some. But the Rehabilitation Act is really the first major legislation to support people with disabilities within the United States, almost 160 years after the founding of the Connecticut Asylum. It is also interesting to note that in this image, it is Nixon and a bunch of apparently able-bodied white guys standing behind him versus the picture here of President George Bush I signing the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, surrounded by people who did have various disabilities. So it's also kind of a changing culture that we get to. So I'll take a brief second here to take a sip of coffee and see if anybody has any quick questions that I can answer. Okay, not seeing any yet. I will go on. So I have this list of laws here because I think it's helpful to look at what the laws are within the United States and how they kind of form this tapestry of where we are today and where disability rights are. So as I said, Brown v. Board, the big finding is separate cannot be equal. I think this is certainly evident in the Civil Rights Act of '64. And then with the Rehabilitation Act, what this does is, to a great extent, it does similar to what the Civil Rights Act does. It puts teeth in the law and basically ties federal funding, so money, to making sure that, for the most part, when we're talking about education and training, that places allow equal access. So for the most part, initially, this is going to tie to physical parts of buildings. So I would guess that, though I've been accused many times of writing this law, I was born in 1973. This law probably has made such changes in the United States that most of us don't notice them. I'm sure every one of us today passed some form of ingress or egress that was put in place because of the Rehabilitation Act of '73. So perhaps a ramp that goes into your building, an elevator that takes you up floors within your building, a door that is of the proper width to allow people with wheelchairs or walkers to enter the building, perhaps a bathroom that had a specific stall that might have handles and is wide enough to allow for a wheelchair to get into, maybe even an escalator. I don't know if anybody listening today has an escalator at their school. We do not at mine, but it could be that as well. So these things have kind of become just something that we have at buildings, and I don't think that too many of us probably complain about them. I do happen to remember in my hometown when the post office had to close because it was one of those classical buildings with stairs that could not be made accessible, and so they had to build a new one, which was accessible. But by today, I think that most of us are pretty accepting of these things. And I will admit that, when I broke my leg or I pulled my calf a year ago and had to use one of those carts, it made it a lot easier getting into the building. So from the standpoint of digital files, which is one of the things that I work with the most, the next law that affects us is Section 508, which applies to electronic and IT. So saying that electronic and IT must be accessible. Now, if we remember 1986 and we remember the technology that we had available, most of the computers were probably one-piece molded monitors with keyboards attached, probably a 5 1/4 inch floppy drive, maybe a 3.5 inch drive, maybe still even some sort of a tape recorder used for storing data. At this point, at least from the standpoint of accessibility, it would have been not too difficult to make this accessible. We're probably operating on a MS-DOS system, which is all textual. If we think about even video games at this time, we're probably thinking about those games that say, you are in a dungeon, you can go north or south or east. So it was a much lower level of technology. Also thinking about things like voice to text. So if people were deaf, making it so that somebody could call through a TTY service and talk to the TTY service, and then the voice would come out as text for those people to be able to understand. Later that was automated. I'm sure that probably most of us are familiar with some sort of technology we use today like that. But it was at least technically easier to do in 1986. In 1990, as we saw with President Bush signing the ADA Act, that basically takes Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and applies that to private industries. So perhaps this weekend, some of you went to Chili's or Cheddar's or Outback or Walmart or Target or something, basically saying that if you have a business that employs over, I forget the 20 or 50 people, that you have to make sure that the business is accessible to those individuals. So again, handicapped stalls in bathrooms, wide enough aisles, wide enough doors, probably automatic doors. So again, I would say that 1990 is far enough back in time that most of us probably accept these things in society today. So you can see again this refresh of Section 508. So the refresh means, hey, we noted that technology has changed a bit. 15, thank you, Christine. 508 got refreshed in 98. So they said, hey, technology has changed a bit in 12 years. Maybe we need to make this law applicable to the changes in society. So in 1998, our computer situation would have been a bit different. So I had a cell phone in 1998. It was rather bulky and had to be plugged into my cigarette lighter. I probably did have 2 monitors, but they were VGA or SVGA. Video games were a lot more graphical. Al Gore had created the internet, though it was still slow back then. So it might take you several minutes to load an image. But our interaction with technology and computers had become a lot more visual. And so the law changed to reflect that. We're going to hit then a dry spell when it comes to at least federal legislation, but that hole's going to be made up by 2 things: industry standards and then case laws. So in 1998, you get what we often today refer to as WCAG, so WCAG 1.0. It was just WCAG in 99, which stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So these were industry standards set up by about 400 programmers across the world in industry to say, hey, we need some sort of language to speak about and standards to assess the technology we're creating to make sure that they are accessible for people who have disabilities. So if we're making digital files, we need to make them accessible for people with learning, cognitive, and physical disabilities. About 10 years later, that law is going to be not a law, but guidelines are going to be reevaluated as WCAG 2.0. Those were in place until just I think just a year ago when it was updated 2.1. But then we have a little bit of a gap here. So 2010 is really the big, newest big law, which was CVAA, which says that if we're going to have commercial video, it needs to have captions. And then another gap, and then this refresh of 508. So 508's refresh, 2017 to 1998, that takes us to our modern area of Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime and YouTube and smartphones and streaming video on your smartphones and a super hyper digital visual age, which we all live in. So 508 basically says, hey, we're refreshing again, but there have been a lot of changes. And currently the law basically points to WCAG and says, you need to follow what WCAG says. Similarly in Illinois, at least for most institutions of higher ed, does not apply to community colleges, but of course 508 would, as would 504. The IITA 2.0 also points to WCAG. So I'm sure none of you can see this screen, and I didn't intend it to be necessarily legible or readable. I'm hoping that Jeff is going to be sharing these PowerPoints, and you can feel free to click on all of these laws that you want. But in that gap that I was speaking about between actual federal law, we got a lot of case law. And the case law that's listed here are against some major hitters like Amazon, Netflix, Hulu, MIT, UCLA, Penn State. And each of these case laws basically, in that gap when there hadn't been the refresh of 508, basically said, hey, 504 applies to this school, as does ADA, as does CVAA, as does the last case law. And so the case law starts to become more and more entwined to get to a point where, speaking today, we know what we need to do to make digital files accessible. And for the most part, we need to follow WCAG 2.1 in most cases at a AA rating or level. And the evidence is pretty clear on the federal law now and the case law. So I'll take another quick second here to, if there are any questions yet. Okay, I will go on. So this next section, I want to think about how do people who have accessibility issues actually integrate with or interact with technology. So in this image here, we have a picture of an adaptive keyboard. So an adaptive keyboard probably doesn't act any different than the keyboards that are probably in front of most of us. However, the difference is that the keys here are inset instead of raised. And so this is really developed for people who have some sort of a motor issue so that their hand can rest in the keys and move to the keys rather than sit on the keys and slide off of the keys. So I don't think this probably is something that's too difficult to understand. As when we talked about Braille, this is a refreshable Braille display. And so as I said, about 37% of digital users read Braille and use this. So you can see all of the tiny pins here. There's about 40 little spots. And so people can feel 40 characters at a time and then hit next and can do this very quickly to read a document, which had hopefully gone through a process to make it accessible. But I mean, some people do interact with their computer and just this, which makes it really important that web pages and PDFs and PowerPoints and Word files are accessible so that the correct information can make it to the keyboard, because this is really how some people are interacting with digital information that we're producing. Oversized trackballs probably don't seem too odd, developed for motor issues. I had one for quite a while for gaming because it made it a lot easier than having to maniacally move your mouse, over your desk, which might be cluttered with Coke cans and Jolt and things like that. But again, for motor issues, so that you can move your hand to move the ball instead of moving your hand to move the mouse across the desk. So if I'd given this talk about 5 years ago, some of this might have seemed weird to say, hey, there are computer programs that can figure out what you're saying. However, I'm guessing that most of us have some form of this or use some form of this either with Siri or Alexa or their cell phone. I will admit that sometimes I will talk text while driving, right? You need to just say, hey, I'm on my way home, or I'm 30 minutes away. You pick up your phone, hit text, hit the mic thing and say, I'll be home in 30 minutes, send. It's really convenient. It's based on the technology developed, 20, 25 years, maybe 35 years ago now, for TTY, people who were deaf, to be able to get talk information through their phone. Yeah, I'm guessing most of us are do that or are guilty of doing it while driving. I hope there are no law enforcement officers in here. I'm pretty sure that's probably not legal. Maybe it is. So a mouth stick is exactly what it appears from this picture, with a person who has a stick in their mouth, usually with some sort of a soft item on the end in order to punch a keyboard. So I will say that I worked with a faculty member a while back. I can't remember. It's math or science. It was something that I was not as good at, but their student was using a mouse stick, and their only accommodation was that they needed extra test taking time. And so I might have been a bit blunt. And I said, could you put a pencil in your mouth and try to type out your name on your keyboard? And they humored me. And they said, well, that was really tough. And I said, well, can you imagine it was math. I said, can you imagine taking this upper level math class and typing out your theorems? He's like, well, I couldn't do that. And I said, well, your student's doing that. They're just asking for twice the test taking time because this is how they're having to do it. And I think that brought across, the difficulty that some people they're still excelling in these classes. They're just having a little bit more difficulty doing it than some of us. And I think that shows, a very high level of achievement. Similarly, the Headwand is a stick of sorts strapped to the head to do the same activity. Single switch access. So these can be set up in different configurations. So it depends upon your mobility. Oftentimes it might be one of these buttons or switches on the right side of a headset and one on the left side and maybe somewhere else. And by moving your head to hit the switch, it might move your mouse up or down, or some sort of a cursor on a keyboard around. So this is how some people also are interacting with computers to get the mouse to move up or down or left or right, which probably take for granted. The sip and puff, so you can see here there's a gentleman in a wheelchair with a laptop and a device in his mouth. So sip and puff is really a straw-like device that by blowing through or sucking on moves the mouse, or can move a cursor on a virtual keyboard in order to type out information. So I mean, it takes a lot of extra time, but allows people to interact the same as everyone else in a digital environment. So I am not going to show these videos. As I said, I'm hoping Jeff will send these out. You can click on these links at your leisure, but the first link is eye tracking. So this is a way for cameras to figure out where your eye is looking and use that as a selection method. Thanks, Jeff. As a selection method to interact with the computer. Initially developed 30 years ago or so for doing tests on how fast people read and where they're looking or observing certain things. Also a screen reader sample. And I would say that this is probably something that we hear about a lot that maybe people don't understand as much. So it really is a computerized voice reading a document to you. Oftentimes the people who use screen reading software will jack the speed up to about 5 times the final output that's about my limit. Sometimes they'll do it to 10. Usually they have to accommodate me by taking it down to 5. But again, this is only if we make the materials that we're using accessible for the screen reader, because it's really a piece of software attempting to understand another piece of software. So that's why it's really important to do that work for these students. So I guess that comes to the question of where does that leave us today? And so I have this nice picture here of a map with question marks on it. So I want to think briefly about US demographics. So I have breakdown from the Census Bureau as of, I believe it was 2017. So we have about a 61% white population, about a 51% female population, about 1 in 4% or 25% or 1 in 4 people in the US have a disability of some sort. 18% of people are Latino in the US, 13% African American, 6% Asian, 3% multiracial, less than 2% Native American, Pacific Islander. So I think that in our teaching, we try to think about what are the demographics, who are our students, who are we teaching, what is the breakup, and how do we integrate these groups into our history, into our math problems. For instance, our math problems may be binary, talking about, X% of the population is male, X% is female, which really excludes, all sorts of other, gender binary and other groups. So we need to rethink some of those problems. But I think that to a great extent, all of these groups relate to thinking about content. And I think when we think about people with disabilities, they go into that category as well, but they also go into a different category where we actually need to think about how do we have to change the medium or alter the medium and not just the content. So that means thinking about making a video and including captions. If, for God's sake, we create a PDF, running it through the software to make it accessible, which is something that we don't have to do for anyone else. So we still have to do everything else we do for everyone else in society, plus this when we're thinking about people with disabilities. And I would say that it often is personal. I mean, I would say that with a 1 in 4 chance that probably everybody in this audience has, I can say in my own family that there's 3 or 4 that I can readily think of that are very close relatives. So I'm sure that we all have at least somebody we can think of that has one of these disabilities that might make it difficult with our current curriculum or materials that we have, make it accessible for them. So I have a few thoughts here on what you can do. So this is the biggest things I do, the biggest things I see we could do. Making your future Word and PowerPoint documents accessible. So Word and PowerPoint 2016 both have an accessibility checker built in. It can walk you through all of this. It doesn't take too much time if you use it as you're creating something. I can tell you from my student workers, I do time tests with them, it'll take you about 3 minutes per page in Word and about 2 minutes per slide in PowerPoint to go back to all your old files and do each page slide. Limit your use of PDFs. I really only see the use of PDFs if a library is scanning books. And then they still need to be going through software to make them accessible, which means that you have to have Acrobat DC, which I don't know what the cost is, but I know that some schools can't afford to have a site license for it. And then above and beyond that, it takes about 35 hours on the whole to train somebody how to use Acrobat to make stuff accessible. And then you need to keep up with it in order to do that. So if you're saving your Word files or PowerPoints as PDFs, I would advise against that because they would still have to go through that extra step. Plan for audio descriptions. So I can discuss this a bit more, but one of the things with 508 is we need to have audio descriptions, which are, I kind of love this example. We had an older dean who retired recently. And he said, oh, audio descriptions are like when we listen to the baseball games on the radio. And I said, exactly. It's using words to convey the actions that one cannot see because of the medium or their situation. And so as I attempted to do, and think I did on almost every slide, except maybe the first one on Sparta, I tried to describe what was in each image that we looked at. So planning for those when you do your PowerPoint videos to include it in the videos. And then so my students work with 1,000 files or so a semester, so I see a lot of files come across my desk, and very few of them is the formatting imperative. And in most cases, if formatting is imperative, I don't think we've hit a case yet where we couldn't make it look exactly as the faculty member wanted it. It's just that we often sometimes like to hit enter a whole bunch of times in Word in order to do spacing instead of, doing things with margins or inserting page breaks or different things like that. I mean, that's a very general answer for you, but Word can do a lot of stuff. And I will say on my phone calls with the Microsoft engineers, I'm pretty sure they're shaking their heads. I don't actually see them, but when they're described what occurs, like, well, why would somebody use our software that way? Don't they know we've got X feature? And most people say, no, I've never heard of that feature. But it in most cases is built into that. So I could certainly discuss your specific cases later. My email will be at the end here, but yeah, that would be my suggestion. So my final thought is that as technology is ubiquitous, it's patently unfair to not make the information accessible for 25% of the population. So Christine, I would say, so I'm guessing from what Jeff said, most of the people attending are at community colleges. I don't know whether that's true or not. If so, I have found at every community college, there is an expert that is often overlooked, and that is the person who teaches the Word classes on campus. I know when we were down at Kaskaskia, the person who was whizzing through the presentation and working on stuff and even pointing out one or two things to me was that person who teaches the word processing classes on how to use Word and all the features in that. I would say in most cases, most of the files I see, there are very few files I see that formatting comes out to be that big of an issue. Most cases, it's a lot of blank characters. I think Microsoft has shared that about 50% of accessibility issues are blank characters where people hit any combination of space, tab, or enter more than 3 times. And depending upon the way that you're using your screen reader software, it will read that out to the user. And I have seen many instances where people just hit enter 54 times to get to the next page. But that accessibility checker will, I would guess, eliminate 80% of those issues. Maybe 20% might even be high that it's these formatting issues. But yeah, I would contact those Word people on your campus, and it might be news to them that there's this accessibility issue. They probably won't have too many issues on their files because they like to use all of these built-in features. So that's my last slide. If there are any other questions, it looks like I came in 2 minutes short of where Jeff wanted me to be.
Well, thank you, Vance. Yeah, we got about, 5 minutes left in the hour here. I'll just ask one last time for any final questions. If not, let's all give a big thank you to Vance In our chat space, there's the little emoji area there, and we can all give them an applause or a smiley face or a thumbs up. And anyway, thank you very much, Vance, for being here today. Appreciate the content that you shared with us. Just a reminder to everybody, our sessions are listed on the screen, but we have another session today at 2 p.m., which is Mapping Your Success, Universal Design for Learning with Zach Petria from Heartland Community College in Normal, Illinois. And as a reminder too, recordings of the sessions will be available on the conference website under at ilco.net under resources and events. If you have any questions, again, I'm Jeff Newell, and my email is on the screen, jeff.newell@illinois.gov, and I'll be glad to answer any questions that we have. So thank you everybody for attending, and have a great rest of your day, and I hope we'll be able to see you here in about an hour at 2 o'clock for Zach's session. Thank you.
Thank you.